although I'm half German. My mother was from Hamburg, so I guess I'm half a hamburger, which might be dangerous in a Wolf conference, I understand. But because of my weak German, I was concerned with translating certain technical terms properly, especially one referring to public trust. So last night I Googled public trust in German, and I was very surprised to find a lot of mentions of clean diesel. So I'll have to use English and hope that the translators can properly convey these ideas in proper German. The trust I'll be talking about is not trust for a corporation or for an agency, but more in the sense of a financial or a charitable trust. And what does this have to do with Wolf Conference in Germany? Well, I'd like to describe the history of a doctrine or a legal test called the public trust, which in fact Germany has adopted some of, and several countries in Europe. But I have to go back further in history to the American Revolution, the US Revolution, to explain the evolution of the public trust doctrine and what it tells us about wildlife belonging to all of us. So I'll begin with a brief historical illustration. And as I said, it begins in 1776, when George Washington and his fellow soldiers managed to defeat the British forces in what became the United States. And they overthrew the King of England, King George, the sovereign of the time, so that the people of the United States became the sovereign. All of us became sovereign. And then the U.S. Supreme Court began to make rulings to interpret what did that mean in a democracy for all of us to be sovereign. And one of the first decisions is very old, in 1842, in my home state of New Jersey, which established that as sovereigns, all of the environmental assets, including wildlife, belong to all of us. And that was the first in a series of court decisions that clarified the public trust and its meaning for wildlife. So for the first 15 years of my career, I was a biologist who said, I never want to study anything to do with law or politics. But somewhat like my colleague Guillaume Chaperon, I'm a biologist who's been forced to come to grips with law and policy, so forgive me as I describe the court decisions. Soon after that came probably the most important case in U.S. decisions on the public trust from Illinois, which established not only that we are the sovereigns and all of the environmental assets belong to us, but that the state is the trustee for us, and the state can never lose control over the trust, even with grants or private acquisition of the assets. The state control is never lost, and any such grants or giving assets to private users can never lead to a substantial impairment of that asset. And then there were subsequent results that clarified that the duty of the government was to preserve and regulate the exploitation of assets such as wildlife. Now, these court decisions were lost for many years in the United States until one particular law professor, Judge Joseph Sachs, shown here, who died last year, he's given credit for reviving the public trust as a vital and vibrant part of our understanding of wildlife law, of environmental law generally. And after his revival, several U.S. states further elaborated and explained the state duty, including that the trust is not static. The trust evolves with changing values in society, and that the uses society deems appropriate may change over time, that traditional uses may disappear and new uses may arise, and that preservation is the priority if feasible, but that uses come second, but deserve a place. Okay, so where does this leave us? It leaves us with a modern statement of the public trust. And again, I'm quoting extensively from Judge Sachs's work, and I'm relying on co-authors and colleagues who are law students and scholars of the law for this modern statement of the trust, that democratically elected governments are accountable to the broadest public interest for preserving and regulating the exploitation of wildlife or other environmental assets as a trust for the benefit of current and future generations. That's a permanent trust for current and future generations. And some of those points I'll return to throughout this talk to clarify a few misconceptions. The word doctrine, sometimes in common English, is interpreted as brainwashing. But in a legal sense, it's a legal test that's been evaluated and helps to guide legal decision-making. Another potential misunderstanding is the word preservation, which appears in legal documents. It does not mean no use, okay? And in fact, all legally recognized uses have a place under the public trust doctrine. So let's go on to look a little bit more at the influence of Judge Joseph Sachs. So far, I've only been talking about U.S. law. However, interestingly, 22 countries around the world have been inspired or in some way adopted some of the teachings of Judge Sachs since 1970, since his extremely influential paper on the topic of the public trust doctrine. 22 countries, including Germany, Sweden, Italy, as you'll see from the map. Now, I wasn't able to find the exact language for the German public trust, but there's a Professor Sand at the University of Munich who's an expert on this topic, and I would direct you to his writings and his work for further information if you're interested. What's noticeable about the map of the world and the public trust is only 22 countries have adopted these ideas. And in fact, the adoption across the United States is not uniform either. We have a federal government system in which states have a great deal of latitude or freedom to create their own laws, their own constitutions. And we see a mosaic of the adoption of public trust principles across the U.S., where here the dark blue are states which have an explicit language of the public trust. The states in gray have trust-like language in either their constitutions or their statutes or laws. And those 4 states, actually those 5 states in white, one of them is very tiny in the Northeast, 5 states in white, in fact, do not seem to recognize a public trust duty as I've been describing it. So these mosaics create a problem. The mosaic can create confusion. What is legal? Where? Under what conditions? What are the duties of government? What do I have a right to as a private citizen and a member of the public? That confusion is often not good for conservation management, for clarity. So now I'm going to turn to predators, why they pose a challenge. And what's remarkable is that even in these countries that have embraced public trust principles, we've still seen persecution and extinction of many large carnivores, many of these predatory species. And I hypothesize that predators are the only environmental asset that some people want to destroy. We don't have other environmental assets like that. And that has created political conflict between, obviously, those who wish to preserve, those who wish to sustainably use, and those who might wish to destroy. So I want to extract some of the principles of the public trust one by one to explain how they might guide us in the future to the conservation of wolves and other large carnivores or predators. And the first one I'd like to talk about is intergenerational equity. Basically, an idea that our environmental assets are preserved for us, but for future generations as well, equally, perhaps more importantly, for future generations, as a legacy an inheritance we pass to them. We have an obligation to future generations. And not only that, they retain the right of self-determination, which means we don't decide how they use or preserve environmental assets. It's not up to us. It's up to them. Now, there's a particularly eloquent proponent of intergenerational equity. I present his picture not because he looks a little bit like a baby, but this is President Theodore Roosevelt from the early part of the 20th century. I should mention, as Mike Manfredo did, he's often credited with starting wildlife conservation in North America. He's often credited for some of the ideas of the public trust. But you'll notice from my history of the Supreme Court decisions that most of those preceded Roosevelt's time, that he built upon them. And he did it in an extremely eloquent way, I find, arguing for this principle of intergenerational equity. I won't read all of this, partly to save our translators and you, but I want to note some of the phrases in bold here. In reference to those that refer to the game belongs to the people, so it does, and he's referring to wildlife here. So the wildlife do belong to the people, and not only to the people now alive, but to the unborn people. And that outnumbers us, many future generations, outnumbers us tremendously. And we have to understand, we have to restrain ourselves because our present day minority owes a great deal to those future unborn generations. I want to make this a very practical, I want to make a very practical statement, and to do that I need to introduce you to the situation in Wisconsin. My state is in north central United States. There's a lake on its north side and then Canada, so fairly far north, neighboring state to Dr. Meach's Minnesota. And in my state, the wolves came back approximately in 1978, and for approximately 30 years, the population grew much as it's growing in Germany. By 1999, we had reached approximately the population size and number of packs and distribution that you're now experiencing in Germany. But by 2012, legislation had passed to hunt those wolves, and the first hunt occurred in October 2012. So I want to demonstrate the picture one might find for intergenerational equity. Under the Wisconsin policy in 2012, we don't see very much evidence of equity because the principle of the asset was going to be substantially impaired. In green here, I've denoted the number of wolves that would have been left unhunted according to the state plan, which called for a 55% reduction in the wolf population of 800 wolves. So the blue part of the bar is how much of the wolf population was going to be given to the hunters who wish to hunt wolves. If one takes a perspective of intergenerational equity, which would have made Teddy Roosevelt smile, I believe, we leave the majority of the asset unimpaired. That's the principle which we will contribute to future generations. And if you wish, a small surplus, if that's not an insulting term, or a small number would be given to various user groups that have a particular right. And in our case in Wisconsin, we have Native American tribes that negotiated a federal treaty with the U.S. federal government, giving them half of any harvest of any harvestable species. So that tribe is shown on the lower right, the Ojibwe tribe, and that's because for them, the wolf, they claimed half of the wolf harvest and said they would never hunt wolves, because in the creation story of the Ojibwe, the wolf is brother and companion. And you don't hunt a brother, they'll say. It's in fact offensive to them to speak of limiting the population of the brother, of controlling the brother. So for them, they would claim half of that tiny bit at the top, and perhaps the other half would be given to hunters interested in hunting. That's an example of how intergenerational equity and preserving the principle of the trust without substantial impairment might play out in a situation like in Wisconsin. Excuse me. So where do we go from there in trying to understand the public trust? Well, we have to understand that all uses, all legally recognized uses that society has accepted have, to some extent, they have some legal rights of use, not necessarily equal use, but we need to grant the legally recognized uses a say in the process of how our environmental assets are used. And what's important to keep in mind here is that certain uses deplete the asset. So in this case, perhaps lethal uses will deplete the asset if we're talking about wildlife. And that depletion is a depletion of the public interest. And therefore, those users who deplete must compensate the public interest. This is in a public trust perspective. I'm not telling Germany or the United States how to manage its wolves. I'm saying if we embrace the public trust principles, we must also accept this difference between uses that deplete the asset and those that do not. And in this framework, clearly illegal uses are the common enemy that both sides should act against. All right. Now, this also calls for fairly careful accounting for the trust, right? If we're talking about a financial, or what's called in English a fiduciary trust, in which assets are being left for future generations, one needs careful accounting. And Judge Sachs was again very aware of this and wrote persuasively, in particular for careful and sophisticated measurements of the benefits and costs involved in resource allocations. Those careful and sophisticated measurements of costs and of benefits is what we often turn to scientists for. And because we're talking about wildlife and we're talking about the users of wildlife, we need both the human dimensions and the ecological sciences. We need Dr. Hofer's veterinary pathology, forensic evidence. We need various sorts of measurements of costs and benefits and of uses, and the integration of those in interdisciplinary frameworks. If we are to understand how lethal uses might deplete the asset, we need careful measurement. If some uses appear non-lethal and yet damage the asset, for example, some forms of intensive mass tourism can have negative effects on wildlife, we need to know that and measure it, not simply label uses as damaging or not damaging, but actually quantify it. And that kind of careful measurement is going to involve, as I say, accounting, but it's also going to require special scrutiny of those uses that are shown to deplete the asset. And this is going to require transparency on the part of the hunting community, transparency as we've seen here today in discussing regulations, in discussing practices, in attempting to stop poaching. And that sort of careful accounting and transparency must take into account the balance of uses for future generations and how much is being used by current generations. And what we want to avoid, in particular, in a public trust perspective, is that one or a few narrow interests monopolize the asset, monopolize the uses of the asset. Okay, I covered that. And Judge Sachs was again very aware of this risk when he wrote, if the relevant facts are unknown, and yet legislature and administrative agencies show eagerness to go forward, forward in resource allocations of the public interest, then the courts are only reinforced in their overall suspicion that they are dealing with government responsiveness to pressures imposed by powerful but excessively narrow interests. So the danger in dealing with environmental assets that are a public trust and belong to all is that certain voices will be heard more than others, that narrow interests will claim a larger share than society really believes is deserved or legal or correct. And here's where the societal debate must come in. What are the legally recognized uses? How much of each environmental asset might be allocated to different uses, and how much should be preserved for future generations? So again, I'm going to turn to the case in the US and ask a question about lethal management, which I can't answer. But it's this question that lethal management has been used for decades and centuries. And in the case of preventing wolf attacks on livestock, lethal management has never been subjected to the controlled experiments, that careful measurement of costs and benefits that Judge Sachs called for. It's never been subjected to that rigorous scientific scrutiny that we must ask, is it effective? Is it working the way we expect? At what cost? And what are the benefits? And let me talk for a moment about the benefits, not of lethal management, but the benefits of wolves and other wildlife. One lesson we learned in Wisconsin was that when the government consistently talks about costs of wolves, it appears that tolerance declines. The people became negative about wolves because all they ever heard from government, from media, even from scientists like me who worked on conflicts for 10 years, they heard negative stories, so their appreciation, their valuation of the wolf declined. We need to talk about the benefits of wolves to many different people, for extractive uses, non-extractive uses, for ecological benefits. Thank you. So I have a rhetorical question because I cannot answer it. Why has the lethal management in the US for wolves never been subject to the controlled experiments that are necessary? It's rhetorical. I can't answer it, but I suspect Judge Sachs was on the right trail, that wildlife management in the US has been captured by narrow interests who do not want careful and sophisticated measurement of costs and benefits. Some of the evidence I've been accumulating now, trying to understand lethal management or hunting, public hunting, as a conservation tool. We have to ask if it's the proper tool. Is it working the way we expect it to? Again, historically, Teddy Roosevelt and his colleagues were critically important in stopping an unsustainable exploitation of wildlife for the commercial meat market by creating regulated public hunting, where hunters had to be permitted, they could take a limited number of animals in a certain season, etc. All the regulations reduced the unsustainable hunting of wildlife. That was critically important. But that does not mean that today public regulated hunting is a tool for all circumstances. We need to evaluate it in every case by its effectiveness. And so I've started to attempt this in an article published in 2009, Hunting to Conserve Large Carnivores, where I started to ask some questions about hunting and other forms of lethal management. And there are several proposed benefits. I'm going to look at one of these in particular, but my judgment is that the hunting of wolves in Wisconsin has generated few, if any, of these benefits. And I want to turn particularly to the question of tolerance, because tolerance often underpins all of the suggestions about the benefits of hunting. The idea that hunters will value wolves more if they can hunt them. Local communities that are receiving income from hunting will value wolves more. Perhaps hunting will reduce predation on livestock, so livestock producers will be happy. There are these many arguments about the happiness, what's going on in the minds and the hearts of people if hunting were to happen. And in this, I'm also going to talk about culling, which is the government-sponsored lethal management. We began a series of studies of attitudes to Wisconsin residents living within wolf range. So wolves occupy approximately 40% of the state of Wisconsin. There are a large number of people living there as well, and we've surveyed 1,200 of them over many years. Our first survey examined when government culling, well, we sampled our respondents, the people in Wisconsin in 2001, again in 2004, again in 2009, and we asked the same individuals over time if their tolerance for wolves had been changing. We found a decline in tolerance between 2001 and 2009 during a period in which the federal government gave the state authority to kill problem wolves. So we concluded that, along with many other factors, that was not enough to raise tolerance for wolves. Then the proposal to have a public hunting season was made, and in 2012 that hunting season occurred. So we resampled the same individuals in 2013, asking them many of the same questions and measuring their tolerance again. And their tolerance continued to decline. So with colleagues, some of whom are here, we are beginning to suggest that the killing of a predator actually may lower the value of the predator in the eyes of the public. Whether it's the government sending a signal, we have to cull these problem wolves, that sends a signal of lower value, or it's public hunting saying, we have too many wolves, we must reduce the population by 55%, and then the government cut the price of the permits in half to promote more hunting. All of these things send a signal that the wolf has lower value. And we believe this also influences poaching, leading to more poaching. Okay, sorry. So this shows the studies I was just referring to. All right, now there's a study that's been talked about, mainly talked about because it's not published, talked about in the U.S. from the Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, which is a state agency managing wolves. And this study asked if, after the wolf hunting season, people felt better about wolf policy. We asked for a copy of the survey, read the questions. They were not asking about tolerance for wolves. They were asking about tolerance. Well, they asked about tolerance for wolves, and there was no change in that. When they asked about tolerance for wolf policy, they found that had increased. And apparently people were happier with the state agency because it was now allowing the killing of wolves. I want to be very clear to distinguish tolerance for the animal versus being less angry with an agency or happier with the agency. That may make the agency more comfortable, but it's not the same as perhaps increasing acceptance of the wolf or reducing poaching. So we have move on here. I have some recommendations for research. In particular, this is aimed at North America, but we may have a problem with North American research if it's perceived by the broader public as being too heavily oriented towards the extractive or the lethal uses of wildlife. And there's a risk of agency capture. I think the scientific community needs to carefully clean up its reputation so that we are again seen as objective and discussing the broad public interest, not narrow interests in wildlife. And similarly, I'll I'll take this in questions if needed. We're now looking into recommendations for governance or for the policymakers themselves. And there's some disturbing trends in my own state that I'd like to talk about to help other regions avoid that. The centralization of power in the executive branch of our government, taking it away from the legislative and the judicial branches of our government, is a disturbing trend in Wisconsin. It reduces the power of the public and the respect for the public interest when power is concentrated in a single individual like the governor. Our state eliminated an office called the public intervener. I don't know if Germany has something similar, but the public intervener's office was focused on defense of the public interest. The legislature eliminated the office. This is one way in which we feel that our democracy in Wisconsin is being weakened. There are also important considerations for governance that come from the election of judges. If judges are elected, becomes more of a popularity contest. They must raise a great deal of money. And then what happens if a judge is in court with a donor or a corporation that's given a lot of money for their campaign? In the U.S. system, the judicial branch defends the Constitution and defends the laws. That does not mean it should be an democratically elected office. That creates a concern for wildlife conservation as well as the preservation of other environmental assets. So thank you very much for your attention. I've tried to present the U.S. experience and some lessons that I see coming out of the public trust doctrine. It's not universally accepted across the states, and it also it requires a lot of interpretation, legal interpretation, but I think scientists in particular can play a role, and the public must get involved as part of the debate. Thank you very much.